Welcome to episode 16 of the Find Your Calling channel. In this episode, we begin to unpack two crucial points that Jesus made in the parable of the talents that will have a significant impact on shaping how we go about discerning our own calling in life and how we live that calling out. We'll also discuss how God designed us to tap into the power of having fun to help discern our calling. I hope you enjoy this episode. As I was going through the disconnection process in my own life and re engaging with the gospel, two questions came to the forefront of my mind. One of them I've already mentioned. The two questions were, will God ever tell me what my calling is? And, if God never tells me what my calling is, how will I live? We've already discussed that God never promises in the scriptures that he will tell us what our individual callings are. He might tell you today, or he might never tell you. There's no guarantee either way. So I reasoned that if he might not ever tell me, then I have another question I need to answer. How am I going to live the rest of my life if he doesn't tell me what my calling is? I'd struggled off and on with depression for years, and I'd also invested a great deal of time and effort in church ministries and reached the point of being burned out and unconvinced of what my own calling was. At the same time, I also wasn't happy to simply show up at an unfulfilling job for the rest of my life. I still loved my family and was committed to helping provide for them, and I wanted to stay around to be with them. But I knew I needed something more to really stay in the game, to stay alive on the inside. The need to know and live out my unique calling was crying out from my soul. In the midst of wrestling with these questions, I came back to the parable of the talents and started to see the story in a whole new way. As I did, two curiosities stood out to me. Why didn't the master tell the servants what to do with the resources he'd entrusted to them? And why didn't the parable reveal what activities the two faithful servants undertook in order to produce an increase for their master? Some may reason that these details weren't mentioned because they weren't necessary in order for Jesus to make the point that he was trying to make. Another person may reason that the servants would already know what the master expected them to do with the resources. But I began to see a different possibility for the absence of these two details. What if the reason that the master didn't tell the servants what specific activity to undertake with the resources was that he was leaving that decision up to them? In the absence of an answer to my question about what my calling was, I decided to try an experiment. I decided to give myself a calling. As I moved ahead with this agenda, I began to ask myself an entirely new question. What would I do with my remaining time on earth if I could choose to do anything? Previously, whenever I had considered what I would do with my life, other concerns had heavily influenced my thought process. Would what I busied myself doing provide for the needs of my family financially? Would it fulfill the larger purpose of advancing the kingdom of God in some way? But at this point, I set those other concerns aside and began to listen to my own self with a new perspective. It's important to note that, at this point in my own journey, I was finally secure in God's undying and eternal acceptance of me, right where I was and as who I was. This was critical in enabling me to listen to my own soul and really discern what my own desires and inclinations were without the pressure to perform for anyone else, even God. I could finally really listen to me. I discovered that I didn't immediately have a clear direction. I'd buried my own desires for so long, giving preference to other concerns and motivations, that I didn't have a clear idea of what I would do with my life if I was the one who had the sole power to choose. Truthfully, I wasn't yet sure what I really wanted or desired. At this point, I was still in my waiting phase. I'd not yet begun the process of filling up my schedule with new commitments that would replace the ones I'd left behind when I'd started this journey. I was, in effect, giving myself the gift of boredom. And it was in this place, in this space, that the seed of calling and desire began to grow. One of the reasons for disconnecting from old commitments is that it gives us this space, this room to experience a lack of busyness, the room to contemplate and be alone with our own thoughts without the clutter of other influences and pursuits. It allows us to meditate and ponder and become aware of things within ourselves and around us that we were too busy or too overwhelmed or too influenced by others to notice before. And it was in this space, while I was asking myself what I wanted to do, a question that I wasn't quite sure how to answer yet, that I decided to do something fun. Never underestimate the power of fun to reveal to you what your real desires and motivations in life are. I decided that while I was waiting to discern what my real calling was, and as I pondered the calling I might give myself in the absence of a clear direction from God, I would do something fun. This decision had an interesting and far reaching impact on my life. For years, I'd enjoyed storytelling. From my youngest days, my playtime had usually involved some aspect of storytelling. My toy soldiers weren't just nameless fighters. Many of mine had names and backstories and were part of an ongoing narrative that would be continued from one play session to the next. As I grew older, I stopped telling these stories to myself and to my playmates. I began to turn this creative energy toward writing song lyrics and eventually writing many papers and articles on the Christian faith that would be published on my own now defunct website. Later, I would write course material for classes that I taught at church or sermons that I would preach. As I marinated in the disconnection zone and asked myself the question of the day, what would I decide to do with my life if I alone were giving the marching orders? This latent creative force for telling stories began to rise up. Truth be told, I had played around with writing a novel in recent years, but for one reason or another, I'd lost interest in the project and put it aside. Now, however, I decided to pick it back up. Writing a novel was something I would put on my bucket list if I had one, so why not try my hand at it now? At least it would give me something to do while I tried to figure out this whole calling thing. And so I began to write. Within about 6 months, I completed the rough draft of a novel that I would eventually self-publish under the title Utopian Day. During the months that I was writing this novel, I continued to wrestle with the aforementioned questions. How will I live if God never tells me what my calling is, and what calling would I give myself if given the chance? As a person of faith and as someone who likes to read good fiction, I've frequently been appalled over the years at how many writers feel compelled to include lascivious, overtly sexual content in their writings, and how much foul language litters the literary landscape of our time. I resolved that my novel would contain none of these things. As I wrote, an idea began to percolate in my brain. I'd long been convinced that our nation's entertainment content had led us down the primrose path to embrace ever-increasing sexual immorality and other harmful and dangerous behaviors. The idea that began to form in my mind was that if unwholesome entertainment could be used to lead people astray, why couldn't wholesome entertainment be used to help lead people back towards God in the ways of truth and purity? I began weaving these ideas into the narrative of my book. My goal became, rather than to write a book specifically for the Christian market, to write a book for the secular market that would exhibit Christian values. A book that was entertaining, first and foremost, but which would also plant the idea inside of someone's brain that God was not their enemy, that it wasn't unusual for people to pray when they were in trouble or otherwise, and that some people actually valued sexual morals and it wasn't a bad thing. By the time I completed writing the book, I'd also developed a very clear vision for utilizing my creative ability in this medium to build God's kingdom. And what's more, I was having fun doing it. Now, anyone who tells you that writing and publishing a novel doesn't involve copious amounts of hard work has never done it before. But I realized that it was a fulfilling pursuit for me. By the time I had published the book, I knew that if I had the option, the calling I would give myself would be writing books and stories. That's it for this episode. In episode 17, we'll answer 2 important questions that arise from the parable. Why didn't the master tell the servants what to do with the resources he entrusted to them? And why didn't the parable identify what activities the 2 faithful servants undertook in order to produce an increase for their master? The answers will revolutionize what you believe the Bible has to say about how to discern your calling. If you want to study this topic in more depth, please consider picking up the 2 books I've written on this subject, Find Your Calling Without Losing Your Mind, and Overcome the Obstacles and Succeed at Your Calling. Purchase links for both books can be found in the show notes below. And, as always, we need your help to spread the word. You can do this by subscribing to the channel and telling someone else about it. May God bless your day. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Find Your Calling channel. And remember, the world needs you to live out your calling. There's no one else who can do it but you.